I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners, and happy Thanksgiving. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from first-time guest Charles Derber, who asks the question, is America committing sociocide? In his new book, Bonfire, American Sociocide, Broken Relations, and the Quest for Democracy. If you've never heard the term sociocide before, you're going to learn about that in this conversation, and I would say it's a rather fascinating one. This episode was originally scheduled for October, but things got ahead of me in October, especially for the Halloween season when I do the Halloween series of episodes. So, this has come out a little late, but I think it's evergreen content for your listening pleasure, as Derber's work asks some really big picture questions. Before we get to the conversation, I'd like to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible by supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Other than my one sponsor, Mike Swanson, it is you, the listener, that helps keep this show going. And like I said, Mike Swanson of wallstreetwindow.com also helps the show, and I would recommend you check out his newsletter at wallstreetwindow.com. He provides straight talk on financial and trading news, and listeners have reported to me that they've made a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. So head on over to wallstreetwindow.com, sign up for the newsletter, and get a copy of Mike's free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Charles Derber. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm really happy to have on. I always like having on sociologists. I think they have a lot to offer when it comes to dissecting the world we live in, the social structures, and just where we're at politically. I'm speaking with Charles Derber, author of the new book Bonfire, American Sociocide, Broken Relations, and the Quest for Democracy. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Good to be with you, JJ.
So I know where most of the interviews I've seen with you start is defining this idea of sociocide, but I was curious why the imagery of the bonfire, and then maybe we can get into what we mean by sociocide.
Okay, that's a good point. Right at the beginning of the book, I'd say that the word bonfire, we think of people coming together and, making marshmallows over a fire. It's bringing people together. But actually, the term in the British 16th century meant burning the bones. And it made me think burning the bones of society. And so it's sort of like it created in my mind the bonfire can get too hot, and it can burn down the things the connections and the kind of bones that hold us together. That's why the subtitling includes the word sociocide, which is a provocative word, and also the word broken relationships. So that's the that's the origin. And I know it's a little confusing. Like if people see the book, they'd see this cover, which is a young woman just being engulfed in a huge fire. And it's not your normal bonfire. It's a bonfire that's gone raged out of control. And that's sort of the way I see what's happening in the economy and the political world and in society in general.
If you could, what do we mean by sociocide, and why that term? Why not? I mean, I've heard terms used like social murder or societal murder, but you
Right,
use this
right.
term sociocide or
Yeah,
societal suicide. Mhm.
right. I'm kind of glad that I made that because I feel still after having written the book, it's a very provocative and useful term. I mean, when people hear JG, when you hear the word sociocide, what's your first association with it? What do you think of people would imagine it means?
I don't know. I imagine a society sort of eating itself or cannibalizing
Yeah,
itself, really.
exactly. I mean, the word suggests suicide, I think. People might think sociocide, suicide. And that's an appropriate kind of comparison because what I mean by sociocide is the unraveling of society, where society is basically falling apart. The connections that hold us together, the bones of social relationship are weakening and breaking. And so this idea of, you said, cannibalization of society, murder of society. The only thing I would add to that is that society can do that to itself. And so, in a sociocidal kind of context, that the way I'm developing the term, sociocide is a way in which society turns on itself and ultimately destroys itself. I did an earlier book, JG, called Sociopathic Society,
I was
which
just going to ask you about that.
yeah, and this is kind of a natural evolution because what I meant by a sociopathic society was a society whose fundamental values are antisocial, which is paradoxical, right? You wouldn't think that it's possible for a society to have or to create values that are profoundly antisocial. But that's the way American oligarchy and American capitalism has operated from the very beginning. Um, I'm using the word sociocide now to sort of signal that I see this trend, which is a very deep and, you know, powerful and frightening trend in American society, as reaching a new stage where we're not, I mean, in a sociopathic society, the norms are exploitative and antisocial, but relationships continue. They're sort of repressive and unjust, but like the employment relationship, for example, has always been sociopathic, but it's been if you got a job, you had a decent chance of maintaining a job or keeping some kind of job through the rest of life. Now we're in a new world where the people have to fear never having a job, that AI, that the new concepts of employment that Silicon Valley and then much of the corporate world is facing they don't, elites have never liked solidarity, and employment has always been one form of relation. One of the things that Marx found potentially hopeful about capitalism was that it brought, before capitalism, workers worked in their home and did not have a common socialized workplace. In capitalism, workers are brought together and they have a collective space where Marx thought they might develop a consciousness of class and of the kind of, ripoff that the people with lots of money engage with. We're now entering a stage of capitalism where that kind of social coming together in the workplace is being burned down. Basically, we're moving toward remote, workers, dispersed workers, workers that aren't necessary at all, surplus workers because they have AI or other, robots to replace them. And I think something like 60% of American workers are now legally no longer under the conventional notion of employment. They're either temps or contingent workers or gig workers or independent contractors. The corporate world has found a way to restructure the workplace so that relationships are essentially melting down. And of course, they're breaking unions. I mean, Musk and Bezos and Trump are all suing to make unions unconstitutional. And unions have been crucial in building a sense of connection and solidarity with workers. We got about 7% of the American workforce in unions now. 50 years, 75 years ago, it was more like 40%. So we're just in this, we're moving from what I think of as a sociopathic form of society to a really deep unraveling, both in the workplace and outside, in the family. Just to make one quick point about that, there's a chapter in this book is about the breakdown of social relationships. And I'm very struck by the fact, I don't know if you looked at this, but what would you guess, JJ, what percentage of the American population eat all their meals alone?
Being a pessimist, I'm going to assume it's a higher number than
Yeah.
I
I
don't.
mean, the
It's like
numbers actually
60%.
range based on different studies, but I saw a number of 68%. I've seen it range from around the 30. And so this is, while I think it has particular importance in the workplace, it's really important in people's social lives. People are reporting many fewer friends. Many people, they're marrying much later. They're less likely to have kids, partly for economic reasons, partly maybe for good reasons that with the problems of traditional marriage. But across the board, there's a kind of crisis of what I call social capital, which is a term that a French social theorist named Pierre Bourdieu introduced. It's very famous now as an idea. I like it because the idea of social capital is a great complement to the idea of economic capital. When we hear capital, we think of money and the economic resources you need to survive. And the people with a lot of economic capital tend to control politics and the society. When you take this idea of social capital, you realize that we're undergoing now not only a really frightening redistribution of economic capital, in which most people are basically feeling desperate for their economic security. They're just a paycheck away from poverty or desperation. And now their social capital is also in crisis. They're the kind of capital that's essential to building trust and a sense of safety and sort of agency in society. If you're alone or relatively isolated, it really creates problems. And just one other thing I don't want to say, I know I'm running on very long, but the interesting thing is that the people in Trump's base, the kind of working class sector of the Trump base, has the deepest social capital crisis. In other words, these folks tend to live in civic deserts, meaning they don't have public space available to them as much as other parts of the population. For example, parks, places, cafes, public gardens, public centers of various kind that allow people to congregate together. And so this is, this book moves into an analysis of authoritarianism and Trumpism and showing that it's a simultaneous crisis of both economic capital, its distribution, and social capital and its maldistribution.
I like that you referenced your earlier work, Sociopathic Society, because I think I want to home in on that for a second because
Sure.
we sort of live in this society where everything is structured, especially culturally, in a way where we think in terms of self-interest, exploitation.
Exactly.
It's all about me, not we. And I wanted
Right.
you to talk about what the outcomes of that are, because I think
Right.
your argument is that opens a sort of portal for more and more authoritarianism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, JJ. That's really important. So, at the very beginning of Bonfire, this new book about American sociocide, the breakdown of relationships, I talk about an African tribe called it was written about by a famous anthropologist named Colin Turnbull in a book called The Mountain People. And this was a tribe that
This is
was
the tribe in Uganda, right?
exactly, it's a tribe in Uganda. That's good. And it's a really fascinating read for Americans for exactly the reason you mentioned. So it was Turnbull, the anthropologist, ended up after doing field work in this society, calling them the loveless people. There was no we, there was only a me. And the reason that is people could only, for example, if you and I were friends in that society, JG, and I was to want to go out and scavenge some food for you, they were sent into by the government into a very remote part of Uganda where there was very little vegetation and food. So they were all very hungry. They were in famine. and sort of like the people in Gaza today. And, so if I went out to try to help you, my brother, to stay alive and so forth, I would die that day because I would be so hungry that I had to focus like a laser just on myself and getting enough food for me. Because if I focused on you, I would not survive. I had to be totally focused on my own self-interest. And while we're not a starving society, we're a very wealthy society, you know, people are in crisis, both economically and socially. And capitalism has always sort of pitted people against each other in the marketplace and sort of thrives when working people are being forced to compete with each other, don't have the kind of solidarity that might bring them together, because solidarity is always threatening in a capitalist society to elites, because if you connect with other people, you might share what you're unhappy about and come together to try to get some more food in your plate, and or to get down grocery prices or whatever it is. So yeah, we have long lived in a society which is sociopathic in the sense that it turns people against each other. It creates these values of focusing only on yourself. And that's what's great about America. The American dream says you go for number one. That's what freedom is all about. Freedom is a negative freedom of just being left alone to pursue your own dream, and to hell with everybody else if they get in your way.
It's interesting too, because in a paradoxical way, it actually it harms our ability to work in our own. I mean, not in our own self-interest, but when you have this breakdown of social relations, workers would actually benefit from working with each other, in a union.
Right,
I mean, there
right.
is the self-interest to wanting to work together, but even that is sort of wiped away, and it's done in a very deliberate fashion. It's beneficial to the ruling class that we don't have those social relations.
Yeah, that's so well put, actually. I like the way you framed that while America is framed as a society championing self-interest and the freedom of people to be purely self-interested, as you say, that's essentially an assault on the actual capacity to pursue your own interests, because you can only in a capitalist society where you don't have a lot of resources available to you, you can only really pursue your self-interest effectively if you're making some connections with other people and fighting together for some better conditions and so forth. So it's well put, JG, that in some way the explicit pursuit of self-interest undermines self-interest, because you really do need some sort of collective strength to deal with the power elites that we're facing today. In terms of moving this toward authoritarianism, there are two great thinkers who long ago, one is Hannah Arendt, the famous philosopher, who, at one point when she came out of Germany and Europe, during the fascist era of Europe, the 1930s and 40s fascist period, she made a famous quote which said that loneliness is the heart of the totalitarian fascist regime. And that's part of a much bigger philosophy. But it's something that's close to what I'm trying to say in this book on Bonfire and American Sociocide, that when you pit people against each other and make them very afraid, it sort of creates a need for a strong leader who promises to take care of you and protect you against this ocean of enemies out there who are all against you. You have nobody really you can count on to protect you. And so an authoritarian leader steps in. I mean, when Hitler came in, the Weimar Republic in the 20s before Hitler was a very civil, decent society. Of course, it was under great financial pressures. They'd had hyperinflation and, a lot of retaliatory sanctions by the Allies, which was, by the way, to pay off the Morgans, who had loaned a lot of money to Britain in World War I. And so America was putting a lot of pressure to get Germany to repay the British so they could repay the Morgans. So that played a role in the rise of Hitler. But I think what Arendt was trying to say, these economic forces, sort of were at the root of the rise of the entire global fascist movement in Europe at that time. And I think Arendt was saying that in addition to these deep economic things, that the kind of fabric of European society was being torn apart by these economic pressures and people being so focused on survival. And and then I just want to mention in the American context, you remember the book Democracy in America by de Tocqueville? And he was a French guy that came over to America in the 1830s. And his hope for American democracy was based on that he saw Americans in this early period coming together in what he called civic associations of all kinds, neighborhood groups, so forth, kind of stuff that Robert Putnam in his book Bowling Alone would later focus on and said, these things are coming apart. Well, de Tocqueville felt that democracy depended on people developing enough cohesion and trust in ordinary life and in civic society that they can trust the democratic process. That is, there's enough consensus about basic rules and trust in other people that democracy does not threaten the differences among people, does not threaten to tear you apart. And people agree on the rules and agree on certain facts. And what we're seeing now, I think, under Trump again, is the fact that that consensual agreement is broken down. The sociocidal forces tied with these far-right populist political are polarizing people and, sort of creating more and more kind of failure, inability to come to common agreement about the facts or the truth. And this is what authoritarianism has always fed on, is like um, people being afraid, seeing enemies out there. You remember in George Orwell's book, 1984, there was the 3-minute great hate every day. The great hate was where people would look on the big telescreens of the era, the videos, and there would be this image of the enemies out there and you would come together and start screaming, no, get them, get them, get them. People would come together in this solid. And now we have Trump saying we're at war. We have a Department of War. We have enemies in the country, which we're going to rout out with, ICE, which just came on my campus yesterday and which is in Boston and where I am and is all over the country. And so we're seeing a version of that today. And that kind of anger and hatred flourishes in a country where people are, I think, are feeling, this is what Arendt and so forth were saying, people are feeling they don't have the security socially and economically to be safe. And therefore they look to like a cult leader. It's sort of the psychology of cults as well. So I think it's still very much the point today.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that really briefly. As you talked about that, I'm reminded of the work of another sociologist that I don't always agree with him with his work, but Zygmunt Bauman and the idea of
Mm.
liquid modernity, this idea that
Mm.
contemporary life is really, you know, people walking on quicksand. You can fall
Right.
down the socioeconomic ladder at any point.
Right.
And I think that really describes what we've been living under with neoliberalism. And I know you talk a bit about neoliberalism in the book. How does neoliberalism bring us here? And for people that I have people that will roll their eyes when they hear that word because sometimes we use it without defining it. So
Right.
what does neoliberalism mean and how did it get us here?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that question, JD. That I don't just tangentially deal with it in this book called Bonfire. It's really central because I already write at the beginning that the corporate elites since the Gilded Age of Rockefeller and Carnegie have really sort of tried to develop this kind of capitalism that does pit people against each other and which has been based on a hatred of immigrants and so forth, even though immigrants were central to the factories that Carnegie and, Rockefeller built. But, neoliberalism, in my judgment, it is an overused term. The way I think about it is, well, I don't mean overused, it shouldn't be used, but people use it for a lot of different, sort of understandings. I think of neoliberal capitalism as developing after the collapse of the New Deal and Reagan coming in, the stagflation, which we're probably re-entering after the Vietnam War of the late 70s and Reagan coming in, where everything was becoming liquid and uncertain and people could fall. And Reagan came in and consolidated that into a politics and a kind of global economic strategy, which we call neoliberalism today, which is basically a notion that there should be no government regulation of capital, that capital should be free to go abroad looking for cheaper labor, that there should be the New Deal was destroying the collective presence of the government and of social safety nets created during the New Deal period. Were destroying America, and we had to essentially move back to that early robber baron period where there was no real safety net, there was no real regulation, there were no taxes on the rich, there was just the freedom of people with a lot of money to do what was necessary to maximize their profits. And that's what's happened to America, after the collapse of the New Deal. The working, I think the biggest political revolution in the last 50 years is that the working classes, which had been during the mid 20th century, had always been democratic in their political affiliations. They began moving over to the Republican Party. And that migration of the working classes from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party has been a pretty constant theme over the last 50 years. Reagan introduced neoliberalism, which and then tried to turn workers. Actually, Nixon started this with his silent majority, blaming people, an enemy within, for the loss in Vietnam and so forth. And then the civil rights movement and so forth. And then, Reagan did what Trump would come to do in a much more serious way. He united corporations with sort of far-right Christian nationalists who were, attacking people of color and immigrants and non-Christians and starting the culture wars that we're in today. And then the really crucial thing here is the Democratic Party, starting with Clinton. Clinton said, we're done with the New Deal. This was, and we're going to start, he called it the new center, the third way, which was a kind of centrist neoliberalism, really. It said, what Clinton was saying was, the Democratic Party is done with the New Deal. He said it explicitly. He said, we're no longer the party of big government. We're now the party of freedom. He was basically embracing Reagan and his idea of where America should go. And it had a disastrous impact on the future of American politics because it drove working people to the state you were just describing, feeling that they had nothing solid to hold on to. There was no longer a safety net or a government support structure or the kinds of sort of publicly based goods and connections that people could hold on to. So of course people were afraid, and they began looking to then 9/11 happened, which played into this, and George W. Bush was able to pile on to this with the war against terrorism, which accelerated the idea that power had to be concentrated in an imperial president who would go after terrorists. And that is all part of the social and political backdrop that leads to Trump. Trump is nothing surprising in that respect. You could see it emerging over a long period of time, and it reflected both the economic capital and the social capital crisis we've been talking about.
So I hope this isn't too off the beaten path, but since we've talked here a little bit about the Reagan Revolution, on page 16 of your book, you talk about one of Reagan's first major acts as president was the destroying of PATCO, the union of air traffic controllers who were on strike in 1981. And I don't think that incident gets talked about enough. And I also think it casts a long shadow today, and there may be parallels. I don't know if you can delve into that for me.
Yeah, no, again, you're raising really great points, JD. I mean, Reagan, in his inauguration in 1980, when he said, my goal is for everybody to be able to get as rich as fast as possible. And then the first thing he did was essentially, not essentially, he destroyed the air traffic control union, which was a really important union. And that was the beginning of Reagan's effort to say, well, his agenda to basically destroy unions in America. And he did a pretty good job. I mean, like I said, at the height of the New Deal in the 50s and 60s, about 40 to 45% of Americans at the peak were unionized. In Europe, about 75% in many of the European Nordic countries are unionized. The Reagan and his successors in the Republican Party went after the unions as a central agenda, which had both huge implications for the breakdown of economic security because unions not only protect their members, whenever unions are strong, when they raise wages and working conditions, tends to generalize to the wages and working conditions of the whole society. Without the political support of the New Deal, remember, unions had been basically prevented in America ever since the beginning. I mean, there wasn't a law, the Wagner Act, which legalized unions, was not passed till 1935, almost, 175 years after the country began. And soon thereafter, of course, in a kind of, ferociously neoliberal capitalist society, that would become a source of attack. Culturally, unions were, communism. They were bringing people together, and instead of thinking about themselves and the company, they were thinking about each other. That was taboo. And so Reagan's assault on unions, I'm really glad you noticed that because that has become central to American politics in the last 30 or 40 years. And note that in the New Deal, reluctantly, many big companies had come to accept unions, and unions were buying into the Cold War, and were narrowing their focus enough that they helped workers in terms of survival. Workers were not dealing with the liquid modernity that you talked about as deeply. But as neoliberal in the late 80s, at the 80s and later, essentially unions became the target of corporations as very central. And today, it's really central. I mean, you have the most important, richest corporations in the world, like Amazon and, Musk. As I said, Musk, Bezos, and Trump are all in court, sometimes together, suing for the unconstitutionality of unions. So you might see this as the real heart of neoliberalism today, is this effort, and it sort of gets at both the economic capital crisis and the social capital crisis, because unions, when they're organized well, are ways of integrating both the economic and social capital of working people. And that's what's being torn apart today.
One of the issues that comes up in a lot of discussions about Trump and Trumpism, I think there are certain types of commentators, especially associated with the Democratic Party, that want to portray Trump as like an aberration. In other words, that he's sort of this authoritarian aberration. This isn't in the DNA of America. But I think that actually gets it wrong. I think that Trump is both a symptom and an accelerant of this sociocide that you're talking about. How did Trump and MAGA politics exploit social breakdown, and is it a symptom?
Well, I think it's both a symptom and a cause. It's like people, as I say, as people are subject to social isolation and competition, they feel afraid, they look to a great leader. It's interesting, when I was doing some of the research for this book, Bonfire, I noticed there were a lot of interesting studies on the people who go to Trump rallies. And it turned out that was a real source of, they came because they got to know other people. I mean, there are lots of people who were going around the country to various Trump rallies, Trump Joes and Trump girls, and they came to know each other and they would have dinner together, and it was like becoming a source of connection for them. I mean, there was no unions so this was an alternative for them. And remember, the social capital crisis is very strong among the Trump base. So in some sense, Trump followers were people who were hardest hit by both economic and social capital crisis and responded by looking to a kind of authoritarian political system where the leader would say, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to make sure that the fear that you're feeling, I mean, Trump said this over and over again, that I am the one person who can solve this, and you can depend on me, that I will make war on the people who have caused you all these problems, and I will protect you, which is the heart of an authoritarian and a sort of a fascist kind of, let me have the power and I'll destroy your enemies and make you safe. At the same time, fascism and Trumpism, I think of Trumpism as a form of American fascism, which in this book and elsewhere, I've argued that American fascism goes back to the very beginning, to the Constitution and to, the South was really a kind of proto-fascism. Fascism is it's a base of organizing society on the base of blood. Basically race and biological. It's kind of not incidental or unimportant that Hitler was fascinated by the American South and by America generally. And he asked his scientists, as you probably know, JG, to come to America and study the racial codes of Jim Crow and the whole development of the American South. And he was not wrong because American fascism began in that milieu. And it's been perpetuated really over the entire, a lot of what I'm writing about, I'm doing a trilogy of books on authoritarianism, and I'm focusing a lot on the Constitution and the way in which the Constitution itself bred this kind of authoritarianism out of the Magna Carta, which was never the Magna Carta was a British document that was limiting the king, but not to give power to the people, but to the nobility who were feeling they were being taxed too much by the king for his own wars in France and so forth. So the American Constitution is sort of idealized, even by many people in the resistance to Trump, as some ideal, but in fact, it was always freighted with a lot of authoritarian. The founders never imagined, at the time of the Constitution, when America was founded, and for years afterwards, about 2% of the American population could vote. Whites, I mean, even most white men, women couldn't vote, slaves couldn't vote, people of color couldn't vote, and most white men could not vote because you
Yeah,
had to have a
they
lot of
didn't own
property.
land.
They didn't own land, and you had to have a fair amount of land in order to qualify to vote. So this, going back to your thread regarding the history, Trump has a very, the reason Trumpism has taken root, I believe, as strongly as he has among a lot, is it has to do with the economic and social capital crisis we've talked about. But there's a history of this kind of authoritarianism, which runs deep in the American bloodstream. And I know this sounds grim, and I also see a very positive history of resistance and democratic struggle. So I hope we get to that because while the book is diagnosing very serious problems that are very personally and politically, upsetting and depressing, I think there's also a history and an analysis which offers people some hope. And so I tell the story of those movements as well.
If we can, I'd like to stick on the issue of the Constitution for a moment here, if we
Yeah,
could.
sure.
I recently had Daniel Lazar on, who wrote the book The Frozen Republic, which is
Mm-hmm.
I think the subtitle is How the Constitution is Paralyzing Democracy. And I think it's a very under discussed topic. I don't even think people want to discuss, the role of the Electoral College in giving us Trump the
Right,
first time. We
right.
don't discuss the role of the Supreme Court enough. So could you maybe dig into that a bit more for my audience?
Yeah, it's really, really important. I mean, on the one hand, it starts with the Constitution, the fact that the founders never really imagined rule by the people. I mean, Madison, who wrote the Constitution, said that rule by the people was mob rule. They were terrified that ordinary people might contest the power of the people who were running the colony. I mean, the colonies, the British, I mean, the American Revolution was never really against the king, quite the way people think, because in Britain, Parliament had basically taken over control of Britain at the time of the Revolution. So while they talked about freeing America from the king, actually, American companies wanted the freedom to protect themselves and get more of the slave trade profits from the big British companies. And it was as much an economic revolution. I mean, it's a revolution of the bourgeoisie, of the affluent who wanted more control. They never imagined that ordinary people would be able to run the affairs of a country or have a real participatory democracy. Their model, and it's in photographs and so forth, Jefferson and Adams and Madison, the people, Hamilton, they have images of the Magna Carta, which was the British document we were describing before, which is known for being limiting the power of the king, and it did try to provide more protections for the barons, the nobility in Britain against the king. But it provided the idea when the Magna Carta was written in 1215, for another 400 or 500 years, the idea of any kind of the serfs or the people in the, in the British nation, it was unimaginable during the Magna Carta that ordinary people would rule. That idea was brought forward by even people like Jefferson and Madison. They failed, of course, to ever imagine that slaves, I mean, Jefferson, even late in his life, said that if the slaves were to be freed, they couldn't stay in the United States. He couldn't imagine that we could have a multiracial society because he said the races were just too different. And that's that element of fascism that Hitler was picking up on and became so fascinated with, about how race had become so embraced in American legal system and so forth to kind of allow this kind of authoritarianism base. But it's deeper than race. I just want to point out the Constitution, you mentioned the development of the Supreme Court. I want to point to the Santa Clara Act of 1876. That was a really important court decision, which essentially was the beginning of the court defining the corporation as a person. It's sort of this was where the Constitution sort of embraced the idea of corporate personhood. Why that's important is that prior to poor corporate personhood, back in the earlier period, corporations, the Southerners in particular, were very afraid of Northern corporation. So they wanted to put limits on them, particularly on banks, and they put the initial constitutional reading was that corporations were public entities. They could make profit, but they were to serve the public, and they had to report. Direct corporations had to usually every 10 years prove that they were to the state legislatures where they were chartered, that they were actually doing something good for the company. After the Santa Clara Act, which was the Gilded Age court that Rockefeller and Morgan and so forth put together, they ruled that the corporation is a private entity only responsible to its shareholders. It's a contract between shareholders and its top managers. It had no responsibility to the public and to the public well-being, nor any kind of accountability to it. All of that was wiped out. And that idea of corporate personhood meant that ultimately it would lead to Citizens United and the later decisions that would constitutionalize the idea that money was speech, and that if to restrict if I tell you, JG, if we were to curb the ability of NVIDIA or Exxon to give huge amounts of money to several billion dollars was spent in the last political cycle, they would say, JG, don't listen to this guy because they are simply exercising free speech with their money. Money constitutionally is defined as speech. So what the Supreme Court did, and this has been a pattern of the Supreme Court, it reinforced, of course, in 1857, right before the Civil War, the court had the Dred Scott decision, which constitutionalized slavery as a form of property that could never be contested. We have a history of the Supreme Court doing what it's doing today. Remember, Roosevelt, during his New Deal period, tried to pack the court because the court was so conservative and was overruling his efforts to create Social Security and Medicare and good working conditions. So we have a long history of the constitutional order and the courts, the way they interpreted the Constitution, as essentially, in the name of protecting the people, actually protecting the elites. And that history is really important in understanding the Roberts Court today and how deeply the current court is essentially in the immunity decision and the Chevron decision, these other decisions, which are basically stripping away any limit on the presidency or any accountability for the corporations. Regulation is no longer constitutionally in order in many cases. This is built into 200 or 300 years of history in America. And it's just important that people understand. The reason this is important is that we have these ideals of constitutional democracy, and they're central core ideas about America. It's the way Americans think of the country. And it's not completely crazy because a lot of the ideals were eloquently expressed. Jefferson, despite his actual policies, was very eloquent. He was a smart man. He was very sophisticated in his writing. And, it did help create a creed of democracy that took some root and has helped inspire some of the resistance to all these terrible developments we're talking about. But the realities of American elites has always been toward this authoritarian model. And Trumpism, it's really important what you said, that Trumpism is in my view, and I try to develop this in the book and other works that I'm doing, is a clear historical evolution of trends that have gone deep in America from the very beginning.
I don't want to spend too much time on this, but you used that term American fascism, and I thought it was really interesting that you said
Mm.
American fascism because
Right.
I know people that will get really academic about the debate about is Trumpism fascist. They'll say, well, it's not exactly like what we see with European fascism. Where do you think people are going wrong in that debate, and why do you use that term specifically, American fascism? Like,
Okay.
is there a distinction between American fascism
Yeah,
and other forms of
that's a
fascism?
really important question because a lot of people just use fascism to mean something they don't like as sort of a bad government. I've done a lot of thinking and writing about fascism, both European and American, and so I have I have some strong views on this. I mean, let me point out that fascism, as in Germany, in with Hitler, who is somebody worth really, if you want to interested in fascism, it's important to understand German Nazism. It was a spiritual movement. It was a movement Hitler regarded. His basic idea was that Germany was in a state of moral collapse, that the basic values of the people, the basic social order was being undermined by forces and groups that were essentially enemies of Germany and of the people. And fascism, National Socialism, as he called it, was an effort to bring people together, the real Germans, um, to fight off this moral decline, what he called moral decadence, which he saw in the cities. The cities were full of German cities in the 20s were full of, socialists and feminists, and they were very progressive places. And of course, the Weimar Republic was run by socialist, social democratic parties that were kind of what we'd call democratic socialists today. So far right politics and German fascism in particular was a both a spiritual, moral, cultural, and a spiritual movement against the moral decadence caused by the sort of I call it blood nationalism, hyper-nationalism based in blood, because it's based on the idea that the only way a society can work is if the real people who belong together in the national community are united and are able to purge the society of the people who don't belong. And for Hitler, that was not just, it was the Jews, of course, but it was Slavic people, gypsies, anybody who was not considered Aryan racial stock. And as I said, his ideas about race were drawn very strongly from American racial theory. The scientists looked at Jim Crow racial codes and so forth. And that's why there is a connection between European fascism and American fascism. At the same time, so in that sense, I think there are the moral, the culture wars. Trump is saying make America great again. It has the same, it's a point to appealing to Christian white nationalists. And so it has a lot of that same thing of saying America has fallen apart as a culture, as a nation. And a lot of it is because we're seeing the rise of these immigrants and these non-white people that the Democratic Party has catered to, who are poisoning the blood, language that Trump uses frequently in his own rhetoric and so forth. That's very European fascism. That style is very, at the same time, American fascism has its own elements, which is why I use the word American, because American race played has played an evolving role in the society. And American fascism was, created a form of authoritarianism, which is what I call more covert authoritarianism. It's kind of I'm doing another book called Wired for Authoritarianism. And I make the distinction between covert authoritarian wiring and overt authoritarian wiring. And, fascism in Europe became overt very quickly. There was no pretense. The sort of veneer of democratic processes were taken away within a few months. Hitler came into power in January of 33. By March of 33, the Reichstag, the German parliament, had been burned down. Hitler declared a national emergency and eliminated any legislative power. In the next couple of months, he had wiped out any other party, had made them illegal, and made the courts basically and the media completely controlled by his own party. That happened in 5 or 6 months. That was overt, kind of wiring of authoritarianism and European fascism. America has always had a more subtle form. The wiring is more covert in the sense that it produces it. American fascism and authoritarianism have always permitted a significant and important veneer of basic rights, right? Due process, speech rights, the rights that are in some of the constitutional amendments, which are, the fact that you and I can have this conversation without being shot right away is a form of a kind of a covert authoritarianism. There's a veneer of practice that has some significance that makes the American version of authoritarianism and fascism more palatable to people because it's less clearly fascist. Even with Trump number two, Trump the first term was still largely part of this covert wiring. The Trump 2 is moving toward a more overt form, and it's scaring people because it makes it more clear that people's basic rights to speech. Will you and I be able to have this conversation for my next book, a year down, 2 years? We don't know. I mean, we don't know how, ICE just happened, is coming onto the Boston campus. It came onto my campus yesterday. I don't know how long this will last, but there is this. My guess would be that America will continue to have voting and will continue to have some form of veneer that will be enough to sort of legitimate the idea that democracy is being practiced, even when we're moving into really scary territory. So there are historical distinctions between the way authoritarian systems operate in America and they have historically operated in Europe. Today, you've got because we have globalization and because the European central banks have taken their own neoliberal route, we have a revival of far-right parties and fascist threats in Europe, which are creating, new forms of fascism in Europe, which have some greater resemblance to the kind of American authoritarianism we're seeing.
If we can go a little bit longer, I did have a few more
Yeah,
questions. Okay.
sure.
I wanted to ask you, Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, comes up
Mhm.
in this book that you've written, Bonfire, and that book deals with disaster capitalism. So what I want to ask you is how does disaster capitalism, climate crisis, and pandemics all come together in this sort of sociocidal moment?
Mm.
And is there a feedback loop where
Yeah.
climate breakdown and social breakdown reinforce one another?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's most obvious with COVID, maybe, if it were back in a COVID season, people have to think about if you and I were face to face in a room, I my my sort of distrust of other people has got to be increased. I mean, you might or might not be wearing a mask, and you might or might not have gotten vaccinated, and you might or might not tell me whether you're sick, right? Or whether you're feeling any chills or whatever. So COVID, a pandemic and the breakdown of public health, which the Trump is now, massively accelerating. It's always been weak in America, but it's being, trashed completely now. It just feeds into a feedback loop with sociocide, where when you don't feel that you can be trust people that you are healthy with them, it creates more distrust. The gun violence thing is part of that loop as well. As people become more distrustful, they buy more guns. We're in a gun buying spree, both for political reasons. About half the people think that there could be a civil war, that they need guns to survive politically. But also, I mean, women are buying guns like mad just because they don't feel safe. They're buying them for their children. Their guns, it's very profitable, and it creates this other feedback loop, with sociocide. In a society which is scared and isolated, people buy more guns, and that creates more distrust, and you sort of accelerate it. The climate crisis, 60% of people in America live on a coast near the ocean. That land, whether it's in Florida or California, is eroding. People are having trouble finding homes where they can get insurance. And that means that there's the competitiveness and distrust people experience as climate change accelerates. becomes more intense. People are going to be competing for inhabitable space as the climate becomes worse, and as here in Massachusetts, Cape Cod is going under. All the coastal areas, cities are under threat. This is going to create massive, new kinds of com I mean, it's like let's go back to the kind of ick like that. Ick is the people in Uganda we talked about who became loveless and totally sociocidal. I mean, an advanced climate change capital is kind of systemic disaster, which is intensifying the the need of people. I mean, the fear of people as they have to compete for food and land, and then of course politically the cycle you refer to is what Naomi Klein talks about, that in these disaster moments, the government responds with more neoliberal, that is more saying, well, we're in an emergency. We have to let these corporations do what they're going to do to sort of solve these problems so that it sort of unleashes a new wave of corporate license and power, which makes people already subject to disaster and sociocide yet more afraid and more feeling of a need for a strong leader who can bring their enemies to task. So, yes, the climate change crisis is really, really important, but it's just one. I mean, I have a chapter in Bonfire about the climate change crisis and the COVID and the healthcare crisis, public health crisis, the gun crisis. I mean, what's one struck by is how intertwined all of these various threats are. You just can't separate them.
Yeah, I was going to add to that because I was going to say I think there's clear sort of interlockings between what we're seeing now and what we saw with the Bush era war on terror, and also what we're seeing
Absolutely.
with what regards to what Israel is doing in Gaza. I know that's a controversial topic for
Absolutely.
people, but
Yeah.
ultimately the war is being brought home on its own citizens.
Yeah. I mean, fascism, authoritarianism is a violent system. It sort of says we need war at home, and now we need to I mean, fascism, I mean, Hitler wanted to show German glory by conquering much of the world. And as he was conquering Germany and from its enemies at home, and that's kind of endemic to a fascist state, which is that it sort of militarizes both its foreign policy and its domestic policy, right? And they're interconnected. I mean, kind of interesting that the attack on the South Korean plant in Georgia the other day was sort of like integrating a kind of domestic war on immigrants at home with potential. And this has destabilized America's relation to South Korea a little bit. It's very difficult now to disentangle American foreign policy, which has long been militaristic. We've created all over the world in the global South, we've created fascist dictators and fascist regimes, whether it's in El Salvador and Angola or Indonesia, and that's been the American empire since World War II, when America took over the role of running the world from the British and the Europeans after who were destroyed in World War II, and that is now being integrated with the war at home. Trump is very, very. We can be grateful for Trump that he's so unashamed to talk openly about what he's doing. He's just renaming the Pentagon Department of War, and he's told Chicago that you're going to understand when we come this week to fight the enemy at home. Chicago is going to understand what it means to go to war with America. And so, a kind of authoritarian fascist regime by its nature integrates violence abroad and sort of comes to see them as a piece of the same puzzle. It's a war against the great people of the earth, largely defined by blood, that is by race and genetics, which are basically dealing with assaults, lethal threats at home and abroad, which are now have to be met by a unified military response, both to the threat at home and the threat abroad.
Before we start closing out, so right now I'm based in Florida, so I'm in the heart of Trump land essentially. But I'm noticing even people that I live around that may support Trump they're starting to waver.
Right.
Because, for example, there's a lot of Latino families around where I'm at, and ICE is knocking on the door now. And I have these neighbors that supported Trump that are saying, well, this neighbor of mine has lived here for 30 years. They're not part of like MS-13 or a gang. They shouldn't be getting kicked out. They're part of
Yeah.
our community. And I'm starting to see certain people that supported Trump uh, changing their tune and like,
Yeah.
the skills are falling from their eyes. What would you say to people that have supported Trump in the past that are starting to see what this is really all about?
Yeah, I think you're right. And that's why I was saying several times, I don't think that, well, it's a very grim situation. It's not a hopeless situation. And I also have been impressed. I did not know that the public, in Wyoming or Nebraska, these more conservative states, people like you're talking about, would come out in the public and support the immigrant waitress in their diner or their coffee shop or something. And that's a sign that sociocide has not conquered everything in people and that there's still these contradictory forces.
I think you refer to them as sociophilic or
Yeah,
sociophiliac.
sociophiliac.
Yeah.
Yes, meaning, which is another big word, but basically means that, the resistance, one of the reasons people are attracted to movements is that they bring a sense of connection and community. That's why Trumpists originally went to Trump, that rallying for him created a sense of community. And the protests that are emerging around the country, whether it's the No Kings protest or these huge, so we've had some of the biggest protests in American history coming out. I think in some sense it's a kind of reflection of the ways in which sociocide is bringing people together. The sort of crisis, both of economic and social, crisis that people are experiencing is I totally share your view. I mean, polls also support this, that economically, people are finding it hard to accept what Trump is doing because it's hitting them in their own pocketbook, right? They can't pay for groceries. They can't pay for rent. They know housing prices are going up. They see what Trump is doing in their own bottom line. It's affecting their ability to pay the rent or to buy a house. Young people are feeling this. It's really amazing polling. Some of the conservative pollsters out are showing, but it's been pretty consistent, that for people under 40, they prefer, a majority of people are saying they prefer the idea of socialism, democratic socialism, to capitalism. They're seeing what's wrong and they're identifying Trump with these big corporations that he promised he would be fighting. So I think people are waking up to some of the problems. And I think that the sociophiliac forces that resistance offers, that what I mean by that is people coming together. I've been an activist all my life, JG, and many of the people I've come to know and honor most and value most in my life, my best friends, are coming out of my experience with these social movements. I was part of the civil rights and was in Mississippi organizing when it was very dangerous to do so, in Freedom Summer in the mid 60s when I was very young, and in the anti-war movement around Vietnam. These movements, which we're beginning to see among young people and leading to people like Mamdani or just ordinary people being out in the streets in red states saying, we're not going to let you, just deport these people we've come to like and depend on in our own communities. There's still an element of the thing that de Tocqueville was hopeful about, surviving in American culture. And that gives me a lot of hope. I also did not expect that so many people would come out in support of immigrants in their communities. And I think that the combination of the economic kickback, I mean, after all, people who came out for Trump were the majority working people feeling a lot of desperation. They wanted wars to stop. They wanted money reinvested at home. Trump promised them that. He thought that his tariffs would symbolically reflect that. But they're not working that way for a lot of good reasons that we don't have time to talk about. But rather than bringing jobs home, he's actually reinvesting more money in the military and disinvesting at home, and whether it's in public health and education or whether it's in jobs at home, including manufacturing jobs that Trump base wanted. That's being destroyed. He's destroying the green energy jobs that would have hired in West Virginia a lot of people who voted for Trump. So I think that the combination of the economic collapse that's emerging as we move. We're still a prosperous market and so forth. The markets are high, but the job numbers, the consumer confidence numbers, the recent job creation numbers were looking really shaky. And I think that the people, it's very clear from the polls and from income data that people who voted for Trump are not getting the economic bailout they thought they were. They realize that Trump is giving this huge, wiping out taxes for the rich. These billionaires are not going to pay any more taxes, but they're going to be, carrying the freight and they can't afford it. And at the same time, they're feeling that he has not somehow he has not dealt with their economic crisis needs, and he hasn't dealt with their social needs because they're still quite isolated. The workplace is becoming more atomized. People are becoming more atomized in spaces where public space is not being invested in. So in neighborhoods where they live, there's less public space, less community development. And so I think both economically and socially, it's not working for them. And in the end, politics, what Trump is doing depends on people feeling better about their own lives, their bottom lines, every month when they go over their budget and how they feel at night about what kind of people they reach out to, who can they have a meal with or, be friends with or so forth. So I think a lot of these conditions are giving rise, and this is a historical reality that when things have gotten bad in America, you have seen movements. There was a populist movement, a left, what I call positive populism. I have a new book coming out in December called Fighting Oligarchy, which we want to talk about again, JG. It's about these movements, including the Gilded Age populist movement against Rockefeller and Morgan and so forth, who were really impressive. They wanted Wall Street to be publicly accountable, and they had very democratic ideas about how to make big money accountable. And then all through the 30s, you had these labor organizations, Wildcat, moving together with democratic socialist movements. That happened in the 60s, the Occupy movement recently. There's just this long string. Howard Zinn, of course, has captured this very well in his book, The People's History of the United States, which everybody should read. But I try in my own books to always capture that in the midst of all this crisis, we should recognize that the current resistance we're seeing out on the street has a long history. So just as Trump's authoritarianism resonates strongly because it runs so deep in the American bloodstream, resistance and this sort of aspiration for more fairness in the economy and for more social connection is a very deep thing in American society as well. So I think it also has, it sort of has elements in the bloodstream that offer possibilities for the future.
I want to ask you one more question because we didn't
Sure.
talk about it earlier, but we have to talk a little bit about how Silicon Valley plays into all of this. And also, I think people are very afraid right now with Palantir, with the use of
Right.
surveillance technologies, just the way in which, even the technology is being used in our workforce now to surveil
Right.
us constantly. I know people that are just saying, well, how can we ever overcome any of this?
Right.
Maybe you can speak to the
Yeah.
sort
Well,
of
again,
curveball of technology
that's
and all of
that's
this.
not a trivial part of my book. In the second and third chapter are all about Silicon Valley, both the way it contributes to sociocide in the sense that the younger generation, but all of us are so wedded to social media and to the screen, and that we found that my students tell me they're 4 hours a day on the screen, but they don't feel close to people. They have fewer friends. They don't make friends online. And they feel like if they have to be online to be sort of with it and together and to get the information they need, but they're not feeling really connected. They feel that the influencers are commercial or not helping them. And then you look at the broader economics of Silicon Valley that you were describing and the surveillance capitalism and so forth. This is a new stage of the robber baron era. We have a new class of robber barons from the Gilded Age. And these are the people that were at the meeting with Trump the other day, singing his praises, who are Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Google, the Alphabet, the most richest people in the world run the biggest trillion-dollar corporations ever. They are the most anti-union. I think one thing people don't understand about them is that they are deeply integrated with the national security state. This gets very intimately tied to the surveillance and the militarism that I think people needs much more discussion, which I touch on in the book, which is that Palantir is known, Peter Thiel, who was the mentor of J.D. Vance, he's a Silicon Valley billionaire investor. He's a far right, strange, weird guy who said that if women have the vote, we can't live in a democratic society. It's just impossible. I mean, he's really a far right guy. But a lot of these very wealthy billionaires in Silicon Valley are moving in this direction. And one reason is they're very closely tied. Their money is coming from the government, and a lot of it is coming from the national security state. And people like Musk are getting money from space agencies. And of course, he went into the data centers of Social Security and so forth. These guys, Palantir is doing the collection of a master data list that will be compiled on you and me and every American, which will have information that every authoritarian dreams of to target potential opposition and stifle it. And the Silicon Valley's economic fortunes are increasingly integrated with the military and with surveillance technology as it basically is building the capabilities for monitoring everybody's communication on a kind of minute-to-minute basis and influencing the information people receive and what people come to believe is factual and correct. So there's a kind of resonance and convergence between Silicon Valley and Trumpism, or to put that another way, our new robber baron oligarchy and the authoritarian regime politically that Trumpism reflects now. And it's really scary because there's more money and more power and more technology capable of infiltrating our day-to-day communications and relations and information. I mean, this is a kind of mind control that Orwell could not really imagine because he didn't know about the way in which media would develop and AI would develop and so forth. So the sociocidal forces and the authoritarian forces that are sort of intertwined with them are really importantly concentrated now in this new robber baron elite, which has some of its own finance, although it's not entirely. I mean, the private equity world is very tied in with this, but it's a new stage of American capitalism and right at the heart of Trumpism. And so, yeah, that's why in this book, Bonfire, I put a lot of attention on the way in which I call this logarithmic wiring and the way in which power is being restructured by social media and the technology of Silicon Valley. And it's really important it's really important that people find a way I mean, I think it's all, Marx said that life was contradiction. Social media is very dangerous, but it's also offering certain possibilities for organizing resistance. There's a lot of activism that can happen online. I've seen young people be very good with that stuff. But you're absolutely right that understanding the power and the interests of Silicon Valley and the technology that they've developed, the extremely close intersection of Silicon Valley with the national security state and American empire, American militarism abroad is really important. And I mean, that's also a central part of my book, Bonfire, that we've been talking about.
Well, I know I have to let you get going, but in closing, is this path towards sociocide reversible? And are there lessons we can learn from historical reconstructions? I
Right.
mean, we've had reconstruction in the past, the post-Civil War era. Is there still, a way that we can get through?
I mean, I think the honest answer is we don't know for sure, but in the book, I do offer, I think, what are our best prospects. And I'm sort of, I believe since I've been involved in these struggles all my life, I've seen when I was organizing in Mississippi, it was very dangerous. We had people being killed all around me. I was getting, I was facing, life threats. I know what it means to fight against a very violent regime. And I've seen a lot of Americans in my generation do it. And I'm seeing Americans stepping up again. So, for the reasons we were talking about earlier, I think despite all these sociocidal, sociopathic kind of forces that are deep in America, there are also these counter sociophiliac people, younger people are becoming overwhelmingly supportive of some sort of socialist, more collective. They don't like a me rather than we society. It doesn't feel good They are looking for some sort of community and some sort of collective, and as well as a paycheck that'll allow them to pay the rent and pay for the groceries that they need to buy. So I think there are a lot of conditions in people's lives that are leading toward a possible really strong and sustained resistance. And I write a lot about that in this book. And I don't think I'm being Pollyannish, although I'm not saying that I'm sure it's going to win, but I think it's got a shot. And I try to point out the historical ways in which these kinds of resistance movements have worked in the past, and what are the pitfalls, and what are the ways that we could succeed.
You mentioned a few times here already that you've organized in dangerous times, and I have a lot of people that have said to me, "Well, I'm afraid to organize given everything that's happening." So I have to ask you the hot question. I promise to let you go after this. What do you say to people that are afraid, given your experience organizing and doing activism in dangerous times?
I would say it's a very real, you're not making it up. Fear is, I feel afraid today. I feel there's fear all around me in the university, which is a relatively privileged, safe spot. I'm afraid. All my colleagues are afraid. Many of my students are afraid. And I would say that one should respect one's fear. I mean, when you're afraid, it's telling you something about real threats that you're facing. And I would say give yourself some grace, by which I mean don't trash your fear. I mean, fear has a lot. It's a great teacher. It has something to teach you. So when you're afraid, listen to the fear. Think and feel and talk about it with people. One of the best antidotes to fear and how to deal with it is talking with other people who are also feeling afraid. And as you talk about it together, you're more likely to create connections and bonds that help you. I mean, the one way out of fear is that you don't feel as alone. So you're with other people more. You're building collective ways of trying to deal with that fear and change the things that you're trying to change. So I say, give yourself some grace, by which I mean, don't trash yourself for being a coward or for not always stepping forward when it feels dangerous. But try to listen to it and see what it has to teach you about how you can. If you surrender totally to your fear, you're going to lose your soul. If you simply say, I'm never going to speak out again. I mean, what are you here for then? So it's a sort of a nuanced path in which I say, listen to your fear as a way of not being totally controlled by it and sort of being able to move forward. And the fact that there have been so many millions of people out on the streets, the 3.5 rule, which the social movement theorists say, which is if you have 3.5% of the population out in anti-authoritarian movements, you've got a good shot of winning. We've already had that around 12 million people out in the streets in America. So lots of people are afraid, but a lot of people are out there, taking risks in a somewhat protected way with the help of other people. And I think that makes for what a really successful revolution or social change looks like. It's like people looking at their fear, realizing they have reasons to be afraid, but finding ways to deal with the fear. And much of my book is about, a system of fear. Sociocide is a system to create fear. And so I'm very, very, this book, Bonfire, The Breakdown of Social Relations in Society, is really a personal book in many ways. It's about politics as personal and about how deeply politics is, invading our souls and our ways of being, and how much pervasive our fear is and how rational that fear is. We have a lot to be afraid of. But we have even more to be afraid of if we let what happened in Germany happen here, which is that we simply normalize the fear and the threat and go about our business as best we can. And that leads to the concentration camps. And we don't want these deportation camps to survive and become concentration camps. So, listen to your fear, but don't surrender to it.
I want to thank you again, Charles Derber, for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope everyone checks out the book, Bonfire, American Sociocide, Broken Relations, and the Quest for Democracy. Thank you again.
Thanks so much. Really good to talk to you, JG.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.